What advice would you give to veterans who are hesitant to file claims related to MST because they are so sensitive?
Generally speaking, I encourage people to meet with a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, other therapist, and get the chance to, number one, unburden themselves about this, but number two, to let a professional help them to normalize it. By that, to explain that the military system, the way it's structured, makes people at the lowest levels really quite vulnerable to people at a higher level of rank who wish to take advantage of them.
Welcome to the Victory Over VA podcast, a podcast about empowering veterans to overcome denied disability claims. Each week, we deliver critical insights to help you understand the disability process, veterans' benefits, and how to take control of your legal rights. Now here's your host, Attorney Francis Jackson.
Welcome to Victory Over VA, your guide to unlocking your VA disability benefits. If you're a veteran applying for VA disability benefits, then subscribe and watch for the latest developments in VA disability. So welcome to our podcast. We are Francis Jackson and Kristian Terison from Jackson and MacNichol. And what's this all about? Well, obviously, this is a podcast for veterans. But it's not just for veterans. It's for relatives of veterans, friends of veterans, people who just want to support our veterans. The purpose of this show is to get information out there to help veterans get the justice they deserve and get the disability benefits that they've earned by their time in the service. And without further ado, today we're going to talk about something no one wants to talk about, MST.
Yes, MST is military sexual trauma, and it is, as Jack said, one of the most difficult topics to discuss both for veterans and their loved ones. But it's an important condition and leads to an important set of claims, and there are benefits available for victims of military sexual trauma and sufferers of military sexual trauma. So can you, I guess, just explain what MST is and how it's defined by the VA?
Sure. As you said a moment ago, it's military sexual trauma. And what that means is that someone was subjected to sexual advances in the military, usually more than just advances, usually being forced to perform some sort of sexual act. And the thing that has surprised me as I've come to realize it over the years is that this is not limited to women veterans. We tend to think of sexual offenses as being offenses against women, typically rape or something of that sort. But unfortunately, the actual number of military sexual trauma victims is primarily male. Keep in mind that lots of people entered the service at a young and pretty vulnerable age, 17, 18, 19, and are unfortunately pretty easy prey to older service members, particularly those in a higher level of rank, whether it's non-commissioned officers or actual officers. We've had numerous cases involving men and involving typically sergeants who are in charge of their unit. And, I will leave to people's imagination the kinds of sexual acts that are involved, but certainly they tend to be traumatic for the individual.
What benefits are available for veterans who have experienced MST?
Well, the symptoms of MST are typically mental. Most commonly PTSD, depression, occasionally severe anxiety, depending on how it all transpired. But those are the three most common ones. And Occasionally there are people with some physical problems from military sexual trauma, but that's less common. So the benefits that are available are the same benefits that are available for any veteran with depression or PTSD or anxiety, regardless of whether it arises from military sexual trauma or from some other cause. These all get rated on what's called the General Rating Schedule for Mental Impairments by the VA. And so it can be at any level from 10% up to 100%, depending on the severity of the condition. Most of the ones that I personally have dealt with have been relatively severe and have resulted in ratings at the 50, 70, or 100% level.
Now, does the VA take a different approach to MST-related claims as opposed to, other mental health claims?
In part, they do. There is a special provision for PTSD claims based on a personal assault, and that's what most of these MST cases are. Not all, but typically it's a PTSD claim based on personal assault. And what the VA does in those cases is they change the way you can prove the MST. They allow raters to look at what I would call ancillary sources. So there doesn't have to be a report of a rape. There doesn't have to be a report of some sort of forced sexual conduct at the time. But they can look at things like, did the person's military performance record suddenly tail off, going from good or better than average to poor or terrible? Did the person suddenly start using drugs, start using alcohol excessively, start getting in trouble, get Article 15s, end up in the stockade, whatever, go AWOL? There are a whole bunch of different kind of ancillary pieces of evidence that the VA raters are allowed to look at in these cases. They don't have to have necessarily direct evidence of a formal complaint that forced sexual activity took place. And that's good because lots of people, particularly men, are very ashamed that they were forced to perform these acts and that it is something they can't bring themselves to talk about. I've had veterans in their 50s and older tell me about events that they have never told another soul. They haven't told their wife, they haven't told their siblings because they're so ashamed about it. For men in particular, it can really be a challenge to their self-concept as being masculine. And it can be really very, very debilitating. And for some reason, and I don't really understand the reason, it seems like people can suppress this stuff for a while, but eventually it kind of bubbles up and impacts their level of conscious functioning. And typically that's when it gets to us. But the question you were asking about, how can the VA look at it? The answer is that there are these special provisions allowing them to look at kind of ancillary sources of information.
You mentioned sort of the stigma and the shame associated, with these types of claims. But I wanted to ask about sort of what other challenges veterans commonly face when trying to pursue claims related to MST.
Well, the other big challenge is that people are often forced to rely on these ancillary pieces of information. Almost none of these claims get reported officially at the time that these things happened. I don't want to say it never happens because sometimes it does, particularly women who've been raped and get pregnant. It's pretty hard to hide that. But by and large, these things get kind of swept under the rug for years. And so when you're trying to prove them later, it is a challenge. There's no direct report. If a VA rater is inclined to be difficult about it, they kind of have more latitude, if you will, when there's no direct report at the time.
So, in those types of situations, what are some of the things a veteran can do to show service connection for, MST-related conditions?
Well, since these are usually primarily mental health cases, what is most commonly effective is an evaluation by a psychologist or psychiatrist. Sometimes psychological testing will be supportive, and so it's really a question of how best do you marshal the evidence as in any other case. But typically in these cases, because they're primarily mental, it's usually a psychological or psychiatric report.
And I know that, for our clients, we work with trauma experts who can provide opinion evidence relating to how common it is to suppress these kinds of experiences and how it's indicative of the condition that somebody doesn't speak out for, years, sometimes decades after the fact.
That's all true.
And so when a veteran hasn't reported the MST in service, does I know you'd said the VA allows looking at sort of ancillary evidence or circumstantial evidence. Are there any other differences or allowances made for claims related to MST?
Those are really the primary ones. It is always helpful if the veteran eventually dealing with these things goes to some form of supportive therapy and that person can provide information, but that's not critical.
And what advice would you give to veterans who are, hesitant to file claims related to MST because they are, so sensitive?
Generally speaking, I encourage people to meet with a psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker, other therapist, and get the chance to, number one, unburden themselves about this, but number two, to let a professional help them to normalize it. By that I mean to explain that the military system, the way it's structured, makes people at the lowest levels really quite vulnerable to people at a higher level of rank who wish to take advantage of them. And so it is often helpful for people to understand that they were taken advantage of, that this isn't something that shows some character weakness on their part, and to kind of help them to normalize the experience as much as is possible with that. Obviously, it's never perfect, but I think that's often an important place to start, and to also try to get to the point that they can share that with a partner.
Can a veteran's personal statement or other lay evidence be used to support MST-related claims?
Absolutely.
And what would you advise veterans who are providing that type of evidence? How can they add clarity or persuasiveness when providing those types of statements?
Detail. The more detail, the better. Detail in terms of time, place, people who were present, who the perpetrator was, all of those things. And the more detail, the better.
Are you aware of, any resources that are available to veterans who are, pursuing MST claims or were victims of MST who need help?
Well, that varies a lot. In many places in the U.S., the VA has very good treatment for PTSD and sometimes specialized groups for MST specifically. But unfortunately, it varies a lot by location, so I can't say that there will definitely be something wherever you are, but I would encourage veterans to contact the nearest VA facility and inquire about supportive services for victims of MST.
I know we've both handled these types of claims for veterans, and of all the really terrible things that I've read about in preparing veterans' disability cases, some of the MST claims are the hardest and stick with me the most. But how can an attorney assist in the process of filing and substantiating claims for MST-related conditions?
Well, in multiple ways. Probably the most significant one is just marshaling the evidence, looking at all the possible ancillary evidence, looking at whether, for example, the assailant was prosecuted. Sometimes it turns out that the assailant was prosecuted for this kind of behavior against someone else. And, the VA doesn't rush out to get third-party service records. But if you point out that, this particular person who this veteran says was the assailant was later the assailant in another case, and that was demonstrated, certainly it makes it more believable that that happened to the veteran who was making the claim. So marshaling all the evidence is part of it. And also, attorneys can simply help the client to prepare in the sense of helping them to be able to relate what occurred with some degree of clarity and to explain the subsequent impact so that when you're looking at the ancillary evidence, the circumstantial evidence, it's clear to the person who's doing the rating on the claim how these things are related and why they're important.
I know when we're working with our clients, the information we discuss is protected under attorney-client privilege, and there are only a very limited set of circumstances under which any of that can be disclosed. But how can veterans ensure that their privacy and confidentiality are maintained and respected throughout the claims process, even if they're not working with an attorney?
Well, the claims material is protected by statute. It's confidential. But the kind of related issues are that there's also statutory privacy protection in dealing with a psychologist or nurse practitioner or psychiatrist or therapist. So it would be very unusual to be in a situation where a claim like that was not fully protected in terms of privacy. The one unintended place that these things sometimes go wrong is that it is not uncommon for the VA to misfile records so that Jones's records get some of Smith's records and that sort of thing. You can never be absolutely 100% certain that some piece of information won't be inadvertently disclosed, but it's very rare. I mean, I don't want to suggest this happens all the time, but it does happen, and that's just how it is.
And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in to Victory Over the VA, and please be sure to subscribe and join us again next week.
We'll look for you then.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Victory Over VA podcast. Make sure to visit our website, veteransbenefits.com/podcast, where you can subscribe to the show in iTunes, Spotify, or via RSS, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too. If you like this show, you might want to check out our free consultation to see how we can help you with your denied claim. Simply go to veteransbenefits.com and fill out the form. You fought for us. Now let us fight for you. And be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.